There is a version of World War I that almost everyone learns. It involves mud and glory, poets and generals, a war that ended all wars. It has a beginning and an end. It has causes that fit inside a textbook paragraph. It has a clean date on each side of it, 1914 on one end, 1918 on the other, as if the suffering started and stopped on command. That version of the war is not wrong in every detail, but it is missing something. It is missing the texture, the smell, the administrative logic that turned human beings into units of labor to be spent and replaced and spent again. What actually happened between those two dates was not a war in the traditional sense. It was an industrial process. It was the application of factory thinking to the destruction of human bodies on a scale that had no precedent in recorded history. The men who passed through it did not emerge as heroes in the classical sense. Many of them did not emerge at all. Those who survived came back carrying things that had no name yet, things that medicine would spend the next 50 years trying to understand, things that families tried to ignore and governments tried to suppress and pension boards tried to deny. This is not a story about bravery. It is not a story about sacrifice. It is a story about normalization, about the process by which the most extreme conditions imaginable became routine, about how institutions designed those conditions, maintained them, and then quietly erased the evidence that their full cost had ever been tallied. By the end of 4 years, soldiers on both sides had normalized behaviors that would have been considered signs of madness before the war began. Medical personnel had normalized treatments that were, in hindsight, forms of institutionalized cruelty. Commanders had normalized casualty figures that would have triggered mass political collapse in any prior era. Governments had normalized censorship so thorough that entire populations lived through the war with only a vague understanding of what it actually looked like. What follows is an accounting of 25 of those normalizations, not ranked by severity, not presented as spectacle, just stated plainly one after another, the way they actually accumulated for the men who lived them. The first thing that became normal was the waiting. This is not usually the first thing that comes to mind when people think about World War I. They think of charges and bombardments and gas attacks. But before any of that, before almost everything else, there was waiting. Waiting in trenches that were initially dug as temporary positions and then became permanent addresses. Waiting in mud that was not merely wet, but constituted, made of earth and water and decomposing organic matter in proportions that shifted with every rainfall. Waiting with nothing to do except maintain equipment, perform small rituals of hygiene that became impossible to complete, and listen. Within weeks of the war's opening, the Western Front had settled into a static line stretching roughly 440 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. This line moved very little for the next 4 years. The men on either side of it did not storm back and forth across open ground in heroic fashion. They dug downward. They built elaborate underground systems, some of which contained sleeping quarters, command posts, medical stations, and communication networks. And they waited in these systems for orders that came irregularly, for bombardments that came without warning, and for time to pass in conditions that made its passage almost imperceptible. Soldiers described the waiting as its own kind of damage, not dramatic damage, not the kind that announces itself, just a steady erosion, the sameness of days, the inability to mark progress of any kind. The knowledge that the wire was still out there, the same wire, the same mud, the same smell, and that tomorrow would be functionally identical to today. Military psychiatrists, the very few who were permitted to function as such in the early years of the war, noted that this feature of trench life produced psychological deterioration that was sometimes more disabling than direct combat. But the waiting was never classified as a threat. It was simply the condition of service. It was managed with work details and small regulations and the occasional issue of rum. It was never acknowledged as a cause of mental illness. To do so would have been to acknowledge that the structure of the war itself was producing casualties before a single shot was fired. The second thing that became normal was living with the dead. This needs to be stated without softening. In the trenches of the Western Front, Particularly after major engagements, the bodies of men who had been killed were frequently not removed. They could not be removed. Retrieval parties sent into no man's land were themselves killed or wounded at rates that made the practice unsustainable. Bodies fell into the mud of the trench walls and became part of the architecture. They were stepped around, stepped over, sometimes used as stepping stones or as material to reinforce weakened sections of trench wall. Soldiers slept within arm's reach of corpses. They ate beside them. They held conversations within a few feet of bodies in various stages of decomposition. This was documented extensively in diaries and letters, though most of those letters were censored before leaving the front. It was documented in medical reports that were classified. It was documented in the private correspondence of officers who knew that what they were describing would not be believed or would be suppressed. What is striking, reading those accounts now, is how quickly the men adjusted. There is a phase, described by multiple soldiers in multiple armies, that lasted roughly 2 to 3 weeks, during which the presence of unburied dead was acutely distressing. After that phase, it stopped being distressing in any acute sense. It became part of the landscape. The smell, which was described in terms that leave no ambiguity about its intensity, became background. Not pleasant, not neutral, but not disabling. Just there, a condition of existence. Medical officers noted this adaptation with what can only be described as administrative relief. Men who could not function near the dead were liabilities. Men who could were assets. The adaptation was therefore implicitly encouraged. It was not named or discussed. It was simply assumed, and within months of the war's beginning, it was simply the normal condition of service on the Western Front, and then on every front, and for every army. The third normalization was the breakdown of the concept of a safe zone. Before the industrialization of warfare, there was a meaningful distinction between the front and everywhere else. The front was where killing happened. Behind the front, soldiers rested, received medical care, ate regular meals, and experienced something approximating normal human existence. That distinction, always somewhat fragile, essentially dissolved on the Western Front by late 1914. Long-range artillery could reach supply depots, field hospitals, rest camps, and rear echelon installations with relative ease. The range of German artillery in particular was such that towns many miles behind the British and French lines were regularly shelled. Field hospitals marked with red crosses were hit often enough that the designation provided no meaningful protection. Rest camps were mortared, supply columns were targeted. The concept of a safe rear area became a fiction maintained for administrative purposes, because without it, the entire system of rotation and recovery collapsed conceptually, even though it had already collapsed practically. Soldiers on rest rotation knew they were not actually safe. They were simply less immediately targeted. They slept in this knowledge. They ate in it. They wrote letters home that omitted it, because the censors would have removed it anyway, but also because articulating it felt, somehow, like admitting that the system had failed in a way it was not permitted to fail. So they did not articulate it. They normalized it. They developed a particular gallows awareness of their own exposure that they wore lightly, because wearing it heavily was not survivable. The fourth normalization was the industrial management of the wounded. By the end of 1914, both sides had realized that the casualty rates produced by modern industrial warfare were not compatible with pre-war medical infrastructure. The British alone would suffer over 2.5 million wounded across the war's duration. The French figure was higher. The German figure was higher still. These numbers were not managed through heroic individual acts of medicine. They were managed through systems, triage systems, sorting systems. Systems for deciding at scale who received treatment and who did not, who was likely to survive with intervention and who was consuming resources that could be redirected to more salvageable cases. The triage logic was rational in the coldest possible sense. It was also, in application, a bureaucratic process for deciding which men would die without intervention, while resources were deliberately withheld. The men doing that deciding, the medical officers at casualty clearing stations, were doing their best within impossible constraints. That is true. It is also true that the system they operated was designed to optimize throughput, to return the maximum number of functional soldiers to the front as quickly as possible, and that this optimization sometimes diverged sharply from what a reasonable person would consider optimal medical care. Men with wounds that were treatable but time-consuming were sometimes allowed to deteriorate, while more quickly salvageable cases were handled first. Men who arrived at clearing stations during periods of high volume were sometimes triaged in conditions that would have been considered malpractice in peacetime, assessed in seconds, categorized with a tag, and moved to a location designated for a particular category of outcome. This process became normal. The medical staff normalized it as professional necessity. The Army normalized it as operational efficiency. No one called it what it was. The fifth normalization involved the treatment of shell shock, or rather the systematic refusal to treat it as a legitimate medical condition for the first several years of the war. The symptoms that would eventually be called shell shock appeared in significant numbers within months of the war's opening. Soldiers presented with tremors, paralysis, blindness, deafness, and inability to speak that had no physical cause. They presented with severe nightmares, uncontrollable weeping, inability to eat, inability to walk, and complete disconnection from their surroundings. They presented, in short, with what would eventually be understood as severe traumatic psychological injury. The initial institutional response was not medical, it was disciplinary. The British Army, followed by the French and German armies in slightly different forms, classified many shell shock cases as malingering, cowardice, or lack of moral fiber. The logic was straightforward in its brutality. If a man was not physically wounded, he was not wounded. If he could not perform his duty despite being physically uninjured, he was shirking. The appropriate response to shirking was punishment, not treatment. Men who had been rendered functionally non-functional by the psychological impact of industrial warfare were court-martialed. Some were shot. The exact number is disputed, because records were incomplete and classifications were inconsistent, but it is clear that British soldiers were executed for offences, including cowardice and desertion, that were in many cases the direct result of untreated psychological trauma. The men who shot them normalized it as discipline. The officers who signed the orders normalized it as military necessity. The men who witnessed the executions normalized it as the cost of order. And for several years, the Army as an institution maintained that this was the appropriate and sufficient response to the psychological injuries produced by the conditions it had deliberately created. The sixth normalization was the use of gas. The first large-scale use of poison gas on the Western Front occurred at Ypres in April of 1915, when German forces released chlorine gas from cylinders along a front of several miles. The effect on the Allied troops in the path of the cloud was catastrophic. Men drowned in their own fluids. They died slowly and in considerable distress, and the survivors described the experience in terms that communicated a particular quality of terror distinct from the terror of conventional weapons, a terror produced by the invisibility of the agent and the inability to run or fight or do anything that corresponded to a normal human response to danger. What happened in the months after that initial attack was one of the war's more revealing processes. Both sides immediately began developing gas weapons of their own, or in the Allied case, expanding on programs that had been underway. Within a year, multiple types of gas were being used by multiple armies. Gas delivery systems were being industrialized, refined, and scaled. The casualty figures from gas attacks were being incorporated into planning documents alongside casualty figures from artillery and rifle fire. Gas became a normal weapon, not popular in the way some weapons become preferred, not celebrated, but normal in the sense that it was issued, deployed, and accounted for as a standard element of offensive and defensive planning. The men who deployed it normalized it as their job. The men who survived it normalized it as one of the ambient dangers of the front, like artillery and snipers, something to be feared and prepared against. but not something that distinguished itself morally from anything else in the environment. Gas masks became as standard as boots. The drills for donning them became as routine as any other drill. The presence of gas in the landscape of the front became part of the landscape. Literally, as persistent agents like mustard gas contaminated soil and materials for days after deployment. The seventh normalization was the regular sacrifice of men for objectives that were known at the time to be of limited or no strategic value. This is one of the war's most thoroughly documented and least comfortably acknowledged realities. The planning records, the staff papers, the private correspondence of commanders, all contain evidence that many of the major offensive operations of the war were launched with expected casualty figures attached. Casualty figures that were accepted as the price of operations whose strategic value was, in many cases, estimated internally as marginal. The Battle of the Somme is the most commonly cited example. On the first day of that battle, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. This was the single worst day in the history of the British Army. It was also a day whose outcome the planning staff had anticipated with considerable accuracy. The plans had included casualty estimates. The estimates had been close. The commanders had proceeded. What is less commonly examined is the fact that this was not unusual, not in scale, but in structure. Throughout the war on all sides, the pattern was consistent. Operations were planned, casualty estimates were attached. The operations proceeded, the casualties arrived approximately as estimated, and the cycle repeated. The commanders involved in this cycle normalized it as strategic necessity. The staff officers who produced the casualty estimates normalized it as professional function. The political leaders who received the reports normalized it as the cost of prosecution of the war. And the men whose deaths populated those estimates normalized it in their own way, by simply continuing to function in a system that had priced their lives and found them acceptable expenditures. The eighth normalization was the collapse of the standard working day and the concept of rest. The British Army, like most armies of the period, had regulations specifying working hours, rest periods, and conditions of service. These regulations were not irrelevant in peacetime. On the Western Front, they were essentially notional. A soldier's day was structured by the demands of the front, which did not observe any particular schedule. Stand to occurred at dawn and dusk. Working parties went out at night when the relative darkness provided some cover. Maintenance of the trench system was continuous. Bombardments were not scheduled. Attacks were not announced. The result was a pattern of sleep that was not sleep in any normal sense. Men slept in short intervals, frequently interrupted, in conditions of noise, cold, and physical discomfort that made genuine rest almost impossible to achieve. They slept on fire steps, in dugouts shared with other men, and with the rats that were a constant feature of the trench environment, in holes in the trench wall, and when the line permitted, in cellars of bombed buildings in nearby villages. The sleep they achieved was usually insufficient in both duration and quality. The cumulative deficit, sustained over months and years, produced cognitive and physical deterioration that was functionally similar to the effects of chronic illness. Medical officers documented this. The documentation was filed. It did not alter operational requirements, which were set by the strategic situation rather than by the biological needs of the men executing them. The sleep deprivation was normalized as the natural condition of active service. Men who reported exhaustion as a disabling complaint were generally told to continue. The system had no mechanism for responding differently, and so it did not respond differently. And the exhaustion became normal, and the deterioration it produced became normal, and men operated in states of chronic impairment that would have been considered medically concerning in any other context. The ninth normalization was the relationship between soldiers and rats. The Western Front was infested with rats on a scale that requires specific statement to be accurately conveyed. The trenches provided ideal conditions for rat populations. There was abundant food, in the form of the contents of ration bags, of food scraps, of organic waste, and of the bodies of the dead. There was abundant shelter in the complex underground architecture of the trench systems. There were very few natural predators. The result was rat populations of extraordinary size. Soldiers described rats that had grown fat on the available food sources to a size that contemporaries compared to cats. They described waking to find rats on their bodies. They described rats gnawing at equipment, at rations, and, in documented cases, at the faces and hands of men who were too exhausted or too sedated by injury to drive them off. The rats were a constant, inescapable feature of life in the trenches, present in daylight and in darkness, present during bombardments, present during relative quiet, always present, and they were normalized, not accepted as pleasant, not welcomed, but incorporated into the routine of trench life as a given condition that did not alter how the day was managed. Men developed techniques for protecting their rations from rats. They developed informal hunting practices, killing rats with entrenching tools and improvised devices. Some units held competitions. The rats became, in a dark and functional sense, a feature of the community of the trench, something that all shared, something that required management rather than alarm, something that was part of the daily texture of a life that had no room left for additional distress about any single element of its misery. The 10th normalization was the management of lice. If rats were one of the two dominant biological features of trench life, lice were the other, and in terms of sheer universality, lice may have been the more complete experience. It appears to be essentially impossible to find a first-hand account of trench service on the Western Front that does not include a reference to lice. They were everywhere, in the seams of clothing, in hair, in the fibers of blankets and equipment. They bit constantly, producing a chronic itch that was not disabling, but was also never absent. They were a 24-hour presence. The Army's response to lice was, like many of its responses to the conditions it had created, practical and insufficient. Delousing stations were established at rest depots. Men could have their clothing treated and their bodies examined during rest periods. These procedures reduced louse populations temporarily. They did not eliminate them. Men returned to the front carrying lice back from the rest stations, which were themselves contaminated. The equipment was contaminated. The dugouts were contaminated. Eradication was not achievable with available means, and so the Army did not attempt eradication. It attempted management, and when management proved insufficient, it accepted the presence of lice as a condition of service. The medical implications were not trivial. Lice were the primary vector for trench fever, a debilitating illness caused by a bacterium transmitted in louse feces that produced fever, severe pain, and incapacitation, and that was responsible for a significant percentage of the war's non-combat casualties. This relationship between lice and disease was not understood in 1914. It was not definitively established until 1918. During the intervening years, trench fever was officially listed as a cause of casualty without its mechanism being understood, which meant that the creature responsible for it was being normalized as an unrelated nuisance, simultaneously with the disease it caused being treated as a mysterious inevitability. The 11th normalization was trench foot. Trench foot was a medical condition produced by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold, wet conditions, and it was one of the most common medical presentations of the early years of the war on the Western Front. The symptoms ranged from numbness and discoloration in mild cases to tissue death, gangrene and amputation in severe ones. It was painful, debilitating, and preventable. The prevention required keeping the feet dry and inspecting them regularly, which the conditions of the trenches made difficult but not impossible. In the first years of the war, trench foot was treated as something that simply happened. Men presented with it were treated to the extent possible, returned to the front in whatever condition medical staff could achieve, and the cycle continued. It was not initially treated as a failure of command responsibility, a failure of the systems that kept men in flooded trenches without adequate provision for their basic physical maintenance. The shift, when it came, was not primarily medical. It was disciplinary. Trench foot began to be classified in some units as a self-inflicted wound on the grounds that men who properly maintained their feet would not develop it. The logic was medically dubious, given the conditions under which maintenance was expected to occur, but it had institutional utility. It transferred responsibility for the condition from the system that had created the conditions to the individual soldiers who suffered them. Officers were made responsible for inspecting the feet of their men. Men who developed trench foot could face punishment. The condition, in other words, was first ignored, then normalized as inevitable, then recategorized as individual failure. What was never done was to seriously examine the structural conditions that produced it and alter those conditions in any fundamental way. The 12th normalization was the experience of bombardment as routine. The artillery barrages of the Western Front were among the most intense sustained acoustic and physical experiences in human history. A major bombardment involved thousands of guns firing continuously for days or weeks at a time. The noise was not merely loud. It was, by the accounts of survivors, physically painful at close range, capable of producing concussion without any projectile contact, capable of knocking men off their feet through pressure waves alone. The ground shook continuously. The air smelled of cordite. Sleep was impossible. Coherent thought was impaired. The famous preliminary bombardment before the Battle of the Somme lasted 7 days. Roughly 1.5 million shells were fired at the German lines. The expectation was that the bombardment would destroy the German defensive positions, cut the wire in front of the German trenches, and kill or incapacitate the German soldiers sheltering in those positions. Almost none of these things happened to the extent the planners anticipated. The German soldiers sheltered in deep bunkers that the British shells did not reliably penetrate. The wire was in many places not cut. The bombardment, for all its scale, announced the coming attack to the defenders, while failing to destroy their capacity to resist it. But before all of that tactical failure, before any of that, the bombardment had to be lived through by the men on both sides of the line. And what the accounts of those men reveal is that after a certain period of exposure, the bombardment stopped being an acute emergency and became a condition. Men described going to sleep during heavy barrages, not because they were not afraid, but because the human nervous system adapts to sustained stimulation in ways that cannot be voluntarily prevented. They described eating during bombardments, maintaining conversations during them, performing routine maintenance during them. The bombardment was incorporated into the normal texture of existence, filed in the same category as bad weather, as something that could not be changed and therefore had to be lived alongside. The 13th normalization was the use of men who were medically unfit for service. The demand for infantry on the Western Front was enormous and continuous. Casualties were replaced, the replacements became casualties, and replacements were found for them. The pool of men available for replacement was finite and was being depleted. As the war progressed, the standards for fitness were progressively reduced. Men who had been rejected as medically unfit in 1914 were re-examined under revised standards in 1915 and 1916 and found fit. Men with vision problems, hearing problems, cardiovascular conditions, and chronic pain conditions that had initially disqualified them were reprocessed through the system and sent to the front. Men who had been invalided out of service with wounds that had not fully healed were returned to their units when the medical staff determined that their condition was compatible with service, even if not with optimal performance. The casualty clearing station records of the later years of the war show a significant increase in the number of men presenting with conditions that should have prevented them from being in the field in the first place. Men with pre-existing heart conditions. Men with dental problems severe enough to impair their ability to eat the available rations. Men with musculoskeletal conditions that made carrying the standard load of equipment across broken ground a process of continuous damage. These men were in the line because the line required bodies, and the system that supplied bodies to the line had normalized the reduction of fitness standards as an operational necessity that did not require public acknowledgement. The 14th normalization was the postal censorship system and its effects on the psychological environment at the front. Every letter sent from a British soldier on the Western Front was subject to censorship. Officers censored the letters of the men in their units. The work was onerous, and the results were imperfect, but the system was maintained throughout the war, and its effect on communication between the front and the home was profound. Men could not describe the conditions they were living in with any accuracy. They could not describe the losses their units had suffered. They could not describe their own psychological state in terms that would have conveyed its actual quality. They developed a language of oblique suggestion, of phrases that families learned to interpret, of silences that communicated more than words. But the direct channel of honest communication between the men at the front and the people at home was systematically closed. The effects of this went both directions. Families at home were operating on a version of events that had been systematically distorted. Men at the front knew that their communication home was being filtered, which produced its own alienation. There was no way to say what needed to be said. There was no safe language for the actual experience, and so the experience accumulated without any external channel for its expression, and the men carried it in the only place it could go, which was inward, and the weight of what they could not say became its own form of injury, unacknowledged, and therefore unaddressed. The 15th normalization was the execution of soldiers for military offenses, which has already been touched on in the context of shell shock, but extends beyond it. Over the course of the war, the British Army executed 306 men for offenses including desertion, cowardice, murder, and other violations of military law. The French Army executed between 600 and 800 men, with estimates varying due to incomplete records. The German and other armies maintained their own execution programs. These executions were carried out by firing squads composed of men from the condemned soldier's own unit. This was deliberate. The intention was both practical and psychological. Practically, it eliminated the need for specialist executioners. Psychologically, it bound the men of the unit into the act of execution, creating a form of collective complicity that was intended to reinforce conformity. The men who participated in firing squads described the experience in terms that make clear its impact, when they described it at all, which was rarely and usually only in private documents produced long after the fact. But what the records also show is that firing squads were, by the later years of the war, a routine occurrence. Not common in absolute terms, but sufficiently regular that they were not, within the army, unusual events. They were processed through the same administrative machinery as everything else. A sentence was confirmed, a date was set, orders were issued, the procedure was carried out, a report was filed. The ordinariness of the administrative procedure was itself a feature of the normalization. Death by firing squad was incorporated into the bureaucratic rhythm of the army as a matter of course, and the men who participated in it incorporated it into their own experience of service as something that happened, along with everything else that happened. The 16th normalization was the relationship between officers and the men under their command, and specifically the way in which that relationship was structured to insulate the decision-making class from the direct physical consequences of decisions. This was not unique to World War I. Military hierarchy has always created a gradient of exposure to risk. But the particular form it took on the Western Front, where the command structures of industrial armies were managing operations from positions well behind the front, created a specific dynamic that shaped every aspect of the war's prosecution. The men who planned the major offensive operations of the war, the operations that produced the largest casualty figures, were in most cases not present at the front during those operations. They were in chateaux, in converted farm buildings, in command posts located sufficiently far from the front that artillery fire was not a direct daily concern. They received information about the progress of operations through a communications chain that was slow, unreliable, and systematically filtered toward optimism. They made decisions about the lives of millions of men based on information that did not and could not accurately represent the conditions those men were experiencing. The men at the front normalized this distance as the natural order of things. They developed an elaborate informal culture of contempt for the staff, for the generals and their representatives, for the system that sent men forward while keeping its architects behind. This contempt was dark and persistent and functioned as a kind of psychological safety valve. It was not addressed by the command structure because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging the conditions that produced it. And so it existed as a parallel current beneath the surface of military obedience, and the men lived with both the contempt and the obedience simultaneously, because those were the terms on which survival was available. The 17th normalization was the medicalization of exhaustion as something other than what it was. By the midpoint of the war, the British Army had developed a system of rest and rotation that was intended to manage the accumulated psychological and physical deterioration produced by trench service. Men were rotated out of the line at intervals, sent to rest areas, given lighter duties, and returned to the front when the rotation period was complete. This system was presented as a form of recovery. What it actually was, in many cases, was a management of deterioration rather than a reversal of it. The rest periods were insufficient in duration to allow genuine recovery from the cumulative effects of months or years of trench service. The conditions in rest areas were often themselves stressful, involving drill, inspections, and the constant possibility of being returned to the front early if the tactical situation demanded it. Men came back from rest periods less depleted than when they had left, but not restored. They returned to the front in a state that the Army classified as fit for duty, because the alternative, classifying them as not fit for duty, would have had operational consequences the Army could not absorb. The men normalized this too. They normalized the inadequacy of rest. They normalized the fact that they never fully recovered. They developed a conception of their own physical and psychological resources as being on a trajectory that moved in one direction only, and they managed that trajectory with the resources available to them, which included alcohol, the informal bonds of unit cohesion, and a dark humor that had become, by the war's later years, one of the most distinctive cultural products of the Western Front. The 18th normalization was the relationship of soldiers to the concept of their own death. Before the war, death in the context of military service was understood in a particular register, as something noble, as something that meant something, as something that was transformed by its context into a meaningful event. The poets and propagandists of the war's opening months traded heavily in this understanding. Death in service was sacrifice. Sacrifice was redemptive. The men who died had given something of value. By 1916, this framework was, for most men in the trenches, functionally inoperative. Not universally, not completely, but substantially. The scale of death had made it meaningless in the sense that individual deaths could not be individually marked or honored or integrated into any narrative of significance. Men died in the thousands in a single morning. They died in the mud, in positions that could not be recovered, for objectives that were sometimes not achieved. They died without ceremony, without witness, sometimes without their deaths being recorded at all, because the chaos of a major engagement made accurate accounting impossible. What replaced the pre-war framework was something more functional and more brutal. Men developed a relationship with their own probable death that was managerial rather than emotional. They assessed their odds informally and continuously. They observed the attrition of their units and drew conclusions. They made practical arrangements, carrying letters to be sent in case of death, making informal agreements with friends about the disposal of personal effects, writing home in ways that acknowledged the possibility without naming it directly. They normalized the expectation of their own death as a planning assumption rather than as an emotional catastrophe. This normalization was not courage in any conventional sense. It was an adaptation produced by an environment that made sustained emotional engagement with mortality operationally unsustainable. The men who could not make this adaptation were often the ones who broke, who went absent, who stood upright when the fire was incoming, who could not re-enter the line after being wounded. The men who could make it were the ones the Army classified as functioning, which is to say, the ones who could continue to perform their duties in a system that had priced their lives and required them to operate with full knowledge of that pricing. The 19th normalization was the management of news from the front by the press and government in ways that systematically misrepresented the nature of the war to the populations who were being asked to support it. This was not a secret exactly. Censorship was acknowledged. The press was known to be operating under restrictions. But the specific nature of those restrictions, the precise categories of information that were withheld, was itself not publicly known, and the resulting picture that civilian populations had of the war was distorted in ways that had real consequences. Casualty figures were released with delays and in forms that obscured their scale. The nature of wounds was not described accurately. The conditions of the trenches were not conveyed. The psychological toll of the war was not acknowledged. The populations of Britain, France, Germany, and the other combatant nations went through the war, understanding it as something broadly different from what it actually was, and the men who came home from it had to navigate the gap between what the public understood and what they had experienced. This navigation was often impossible. The gap was too wide. The language available for describing the actual experience was inadequate, and even when language was available, the audience was not prepared to receive what it conveyed. The men normalized the gap by not attempting to cross it. They did not, in most cases, describe what they had seen and done and endured. They said it was bad and changed the subject. They said you had to have been there and left it at that. And the populations they returned to, receiving only this residue of the actual experience, normalized their own ignorance as the natural consequence of civilian distance from military service and did not press for what was being withheld. The 20th normalization was the industrial manufacture of the war's material infrastructure and the human beings who operated it. The Western Front required constant resupply. Artillery shells were consumed at rates that required industrial production on a scale that transformed the economies of the combatant nations. The British alone fired approximately 170 million shells during the war. Each of those shells was manufactured, transported, stored, and delivered to a gun crew by a chain of human labor that extended from factory floors in the industrial cities of Britain and France to the muddy ammunition dumps of the Western Front. The workers in those factories were overwhelmingly women, in a shift that had no peacetime precedent. The conditions in the munitions factories were dangerous. The chemicals used in shell filling caused jaundice and other toxic effects in the workers exposed to them. Factory accidents killed workers in numbers that were not publicly reported with accuracy. The production quotas were set by military requirements rather than by the capacities of the workforce, and the workforce was pushed to meet those quotas in conditions that normalized industrial injury and illness as acceptable costs of the national effort. Both ends of this supply chain, the factory floor and the gun pit, were managed by the same essential logic. Human labor and human bodies were inputs into an industrial process whose outputs were measured in shells fired and targets suppressed. The people who performed this labor, whether they were in factories in Sheffield or gun pits in Flanders, were priced at the level of industrial inputs, which is to say, at the level of what it cost to replace them when they broke, which over the course of the war turned out to be considerably less than anyone had anticipated, because the supply of replaceable human beings proved to be large enough to sustain the process for 4 years. The 21st normalization was the management of soldiers' religious and moral frameworks in ways that served operational efficiency rather than their actual spiritual or psychological needs. The war produced, for many of the men who served in it, a crisis of religious belief. The pre-war world had operated on frameworks, both formally religious and informally moral, that assigned meaning to suffering and purpose to death. The conditions of the Western Front were not compatible with those frameworks. The suffering was too extensive, too arbitrary, too indifferent to any principle of justice or meaning that the available religious traditions could convincingly explain. Military chaplains operated in this gap between the frameworks men had brought into the war and the conditions those frameworks could not accommodate. Some chaplains functioned as genuine pastoral figures, as men who acknowledged the reality of what the soldiers were experiencing and engaged with it honestly. But the institutional role of the chaplain was also, and perhaps primarily, to maintain morale, which meant maintaining the frameworks that sustained the willingness to continue fighting, which meant not fully engaging with the crisis those frameworks were undergoing. The practical result was a kind of managed religious ambiguity. Formal observances were maintained, services were held, last rites were administered when circumstances permitted. But the deeper questions, the ones about whether the war made any sense at all, about whether the deaths had any meaning, about whether the God the armies prayed to could be reconciled with the God of the mud and the rats and the unburied dead, were not addressed by the institutional chaplaincy in any adequate way. The men were left to manage these questions privately, and most of them managed them by setting them aside, rather than by resolving them, and the unresolved questions became part of the accumulation of damage that the men carried forward into whatever came after the war. The 22nd normalization was the bureaucratic processing of grief. When a British soldier died on the Western Front, his death entered a bureaucratic chain. A death certificate was issued. A notification was sent to his next of kin. His pay was calculated to the date of death, and his remaining effects were inventoried. If he had life insurance through the army, a claim was initiated. If he had outstanding debts to the army, those were noted. His personal possessions, if any had been retrieved, were packaged and mailed home. This process was designed to be efficient, and it was. It processed hundreds of thousands of deaths across the war's duration. What it was not designed to do was to acknowledge, in any meaningful way, the content of what had happened. The letters sent to next of kin were, for most of the war, standardized in format and limited in content. They confirmed the death. They offered condolences in standard language. They said, when it could be said truthfully, that the man had died bravely. They rarely contained anything specific about the actual circumstances of the death, partly because those circumstances were often too chaotic and too ugly to describe, and partly because the system that sent them was not designed to communicate anything that was not compatible with maintaining the public's willingness to continue supporting the war. Families received these letters and were expected to grieve within them, to accept the standardized condolence as sufficient acknowledgement of what they had lost. Many families found this impossible. Many of them spent years after the war attempting to find out what had actually happened. Writing to the army, writing to their son's commanding officer, writing to anyone who might have been present. Many of these inquiries produced nothing useful because the people who might have answered them were dead or scattered, or simply not in a position to communicate what they had seen. The gap between the bureaucratic processing of death and the actual experience of loss was enormous, and the families were expected to bridge it with what the system had provided, which was almost nothing. The 23rd normalization was the physical transformation of the landscape of the Western Front and the normalization of living within that transformation. The landscape of Belgian Flanders and northeastern France, across which the Western Front ran, had been before the war agricultural and industrial and inhabited. It had villages with churches and farms, with fields and towns with markets. It had a particular character, a particular texture that belonged to the cultures that had developed there over centuries. By the middle years of the war, this landscape had been essentially erased over a substantial portion of its extent. The artillery had done it. Millions of shells falling on the same ground over the same years had destroyed the surface of the earth in ways that were not merely destructive, but transformative, reducing the landscape to a surface of craters, some of them enormous, filled with water and mud, separated by ridges of churned earth and rusting wire, stripped of trees, of buildings, of any feature that had existed before the war. The village of Passchendaele in Belgium was not damaged in the ordinary sense by the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. It was removed from the surface of the earth. When the battle was over, the location where it had stood could not be identified without a map. The men who fought across this landscape normalized it as the natural environment of the war. They developed a detailed practical knowledge of it. They named its features, giving the craters and ridges and ditches the names of the things that had existed there before, or the names of events or casualties associated with them. They navigated it with a competence that required months of experience to develop, and that was utterly useless in any other context. They inhabited it, and the inhabiting of it, the building of lives within it, the development of knowledge and skill specific to it, was itself a normalization of something that should not have been normalizable, which was the complete industrial annihilation of the human world. The 24th normalization was the use of underage soldiers and the administrative machinery that facilitated it. The minimum age for British military service was 18 for home service and 19 for overseas service. These minimums were, from the early months of the war, routinely ignored. Boys as young as 14 and 15 presented themselves at recruiting offices and were accepted, either because the recruiting staff did not verify their stated ages or because they actively chose not to do so. The pressure on recruiting officers to meet quotas was significant, and a willing volunteer, regardless of age, resolved that pressure. The number of underage soldiers who served in the British Army during World War I has been estimated at various figures, with reliable calculations suggesting it was in the tens of thousands. Some of these boys were killed, some were wounded, some survived but had been exposed to the full range of the Western Front's conditions during years that were, in a biological and psychological sense, particularly formative. The developmental consequences of that exposure were not studied systematically and were not acknowledged institutionally. When underage soldiers were identified, they were sometimes, but not always, removed from the front. The removal procedure was itself bureaucratic and inconsistently applied. And in many cases, boys who were removed simply re-enlisted under different names in different towns and returned to the war. The Army normalized the presence of underage soldiers by not looking for them too hard. The Army needed bodies. The boys presented themselves. The administrative machinery processed them. The question of their age was a complication that the system had an informal incentive to overlook, and it overlooked it at scale. And the boys fought and died and were wounded and were broken alongside the men, and the records of many of them list their ages as the ages they had claimed rather than the ages they actually were, so that even now the data understates the degree to which the war consumed its youngest participants. The 25th normalization was the manner in which the war ended. The armistice of November 11, 1918, was concluded at 5 in the morning on that day and was to take effect at 11 o'clock. In the 6 hours between the signing and the ceasefire, fighting continued along the entire Western Front. Artillery fired. Attacks were launched. Men were killed in the full awareness at every level from private soldier to army commander that the war was hours from its end. The casualty figures for the final day of the war are striking in context. On November 11, 1918, the last day of World War I, the Allied and Central Powers forces suffered approximately 11,000 casualties. This figure is higher than the average daily casualty rate for many of the war's quieter periods. It is, by any normal standard, a catastrophic number of human losses. It was also the last day. Everyone knew it was the last day. The 11 o'clock end was known at dawn. And the killing continued because the institutional machinery of the war had no mechanism for stopping before the designated time, and because the commanders along the front, operating within that machinery, continued to issue orders consistent with the prosecution of the war, and because the men receiving those orders continued to carry them out. The men who survived the last hours of November 11th and walked into the silence of the ceasefire had been normalized through 4 years of this machinery into a state where being ordered to attack on the final morning of a war that was already over was something they could receive and execute without the machinery breaking down. The machinery worked on the last day of the war exactly as it had worked on every other day, efficiently and indifferently, producing casualties at a rate consistent with normal operations right up until the moment it was told to stop. The war claimed approximately 17 million lives, military and civilian. The wounded numbered at least 20 million more. The psychological casualties were never accurately counted because the systems for counting them did not exist, and because many of the men who carried that damage went to their graves carrying it rather than to any institution that might have recorded it. The total transformation of what human beings could normalize, what conditions they could incorporate into a functional existence, what losses they could absorb and continue, was not tallied in any document and does not appear in any official record. The armies demobilized. The men went home. The trenches were gradually reclaimed by vegetation and are, in some places, still visible from the air. The bureaucratic apparatus that had managed the killing issued its final reports, filed its final documents, and reduced its operations to the peacetime scale required for the administration of its consequences. The pension applications arrived. The missing persons inquiries arrived. The letters asking for information about the final hours of sons and husbands and brothers arrived. The administrative machinery processed them according to its established procedures. The medical category of shell shock was officially discontinued in the British Army in 1920. It was replaced with other categories that covered some of the same presentations, but the specific designation and its associated acknowledgement of the war's psychological damage was removed from the official vocabulary. Men who had been classified under it before the discontinuation continued to appear in pension records, but the category itself was closed. The war, in that sense, was still being administered. Its paperwork continued. Its costs were still being processed. But the framework for understanding what it had done to the men who served in it was quietly narrowed. And the narrowing was itself not announced, and the men whose conditions fell into the space that the narrowing created were simply no longer classifiable in the way they had been. And the system continued, and the paperwork continued, and the last veterans of the Western Front carried what they carried for decades more, and the administrative record of what had been done to them and what they had been required to do remained incomplete, as it had always been and as it remains.